Ahoy there folks, I'm Captain Benzie and welcome to another blueprint breakdown video for Infinite Lagrange, the series where I take a look at an individual type of ship and discuss it and all its variations to give you my thoughts and opinions onto whether or not they're worth including in different fleets. In today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the Noma shipping group, Taurus Destroyer. This is one of those famous ships. A lot of people talk about it, a lot of people wax lyrical, but there are three variants and they are quite interesting to look at and discuss. Before we jump in though, I just want to say the recent update to Infinite Lagrange, in my opinion, is just absolutely stunning. I mean, look, let's just jump in here on this particular little X8 and just have a look at the background now, for crying out loud. The fact they've added these really beautiful nebulae into here. They're higher resolution graphics on things like the different asteroids and that. In fact, let's find one that's not moving so that we can get a better look-see at some of those details. Just look at that. They've turned what was already one of the most beautiful games on mobile into hands down the most beautiful game on mobile, and I am all here for it. Anyway, waxing lyrical aside, let's have a look then in today's video at the Taurus Destroyer. Please hit like on this video if you enjoy it. The 5 seconds it takes you to hit like really helps me out. I do have a merchandise store and I do have a Patreon if you want to go the extra mile to help support this channel, and that would be awesome. Otherwise, let's jump into the blueprints. We are going to narrow this down to Destroyer, and we're going to have a look at the Taurus. Now the Taurus, as I said, this is one of those ships that is a little bit infamous in Infinite Lagrange anyway. Three different types: offensive, assault, and defensive type. Lots of people wax lyrical about this as being one of the best ships in the game, and I do definitely agree. But let's start off then by looking at Type A, the offensive type, the Taurus Pulse Cannon Destroyer. Now this is it here on screen, and this is obviously the first one that you will come across as you find the blueprint, and it is a beast. Its basic firepower, 6,210 anti-ship firepower, 2,994 anti-air, and 338 siege. That's nothing to sniff at. It also has surprisingly high defense, 32,980 with a solid 20 armor. Its main downside on its stat page comes at its speed, 650 flight velocity, 3,250 on warp velocity. That slows your fleet all the way down. And ultimately, there is certainly a point that could be made about actually using propulsion system upgrades on this, not just to draw the rest of your fleet, especially in the early game, down to a crawling halt. Because other destroyers at this time are still going 850, same sort of speeds as frigates. This one is going slower than most cruisers, which really can slow down your opportunities. Now beyond that though, its main bonus here is its Oxhorn pulse cannon system, and this comes in two parts: the experimental pulse turret with a whopping 4,830 DPM a minute, energy shield penetration, which is just amazing. Super capital ships, it can disable their energy shields completely. Energy shields normally absorb a percentage of damage. With the Taurus, you have a chance of just switching that off. Also, anti-aircraft range is surprisingly useful as well. Does allow you to hit some enemy aircraft if there's really nothing else around you, and that's more what the rapid fire here does as well. This is prioritized against aircraft, then it will go after destroyers and frigates, and with anti-aircraft range and a lot lower. Both of them do have that same priority: destroyer and frigate, followed by corvette and fighter, with the anti-air gun being the corvette and fighter at top, with destroyer and frigate as secondary. Now, these do use electromagnetic stuff here, so you're going to need like pulse cannon techs and that to upgrade these 3 at a time. It is fairly costly. Those can be quite difficult blueprints to find, so you do need to really prioritize whether or not you want to use them. Beyond this though, let's actually have a look at how this enhances, and it's not just here, but we'll start here and work outwards. First of all, the prioritized firepower. This, for me, is absolutely essential for the Taurus. The Taurus never really should be trying to shoot at nearby aircraft. There are better options to put in your fleet for that, and having this prioritized firepower reduces the primary cooldown of this one, turns off other weapons in the system every 90 seconds for 15 seconds. Stop shooting at aircraft, deal more damage to the stuff you actually want dead. Absolutely a must. Get that on there as soon as possible. Then, of course, we have our usuals, including all pulse cannon damage, increasing all pulse cannon damage, decreasing the weapon system cooldown. This has got diminishing returns, and it doesn't really show very well on here. I do actually prefer the pulse cannon damage rather than the weapon system cooldown, despite the fact the weapon system cooldown technically says that it's got more in the way of DPM. Ultimately, you'll notice that the pulse cannons do fire remarkably quickly anyway. You don't really need those weapon system cooldowns as much as you might think. The DPM sort of lies to you. By the time you've got the prioritized firepower on here, the straight up damage does ultimately do more. At least in my testing it has. Finally, we have our usual increased weapon hit rate against frigates and destroyers. Those are going to be your primary target early on in the game, so you may decide you want to do those. That said, I found the Taurus actually hits a lot of the time anyway. It doesn't really need these. Certainly it doesn't need both of them, I find. Unless you're going up against someone who clearly has a lot of evasion tanking, then yeah, maybe. Finally, increases weapon hit rate against fighters and corvettes. I have never taken this. I do not see why I would ever take this. It is just, to me, it's there. It's there, and it doesn't actually do anything. It's probably better if it didn't even have it. But on the subject of weapon damage, we do also have the energy system. This is just amazing because it actually increases the pulse cannon damage by an additional 15% just by having it. Then this energy system can be further enhanced to increase the main pulse cannon damage and decrease the weapon system cooldown even further. So that's just a nice little touch there that does mean the Taurus is fairly aggressive on its tech point usage. You are going to be putting a lot of tech points into this in order to max it out, but the damage it can do is frankly terrifying. Now, it is a front row ship, so having some armor isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's got pretty good basic armor to start with, and by the time you add on the enhancements there, it does actually become remarkably tanky. There are better options out there if you just want a straight tank, but if you've just got this one destroyer and you want it to survive as long as possible, yeah, pump up the damage and then pump up the armor in response there as well. On that subject though, if we go into the propulsion system, you'll notice that we do have our cruising speed and we've got our warp speed bonuses, but we actually have evasion upgrades as well, which wholeheartedly you should be taking. I would take these ahead of taking the armor ones, because in my eyes, it's better to not get hit than it is to reduce the damage you take when you get hit. Go for these ones first, then take the armor upgrades on top of that. Now, it's expensive, there's no two ways about it. 8 command points is typical for a destroyer. Its actual build costs aren't particularly high, but the amount of tech points this ship is going to demand, it's just going to devour your tech points, get you to pour all of your destroyer tech points into this, but it will reward you for doing so. Let's move on to the Type B then, the Assault Destroyer. Now this is my personal favourite of the three. It's the one I've upgraded for this particular server. You can see 10 of them in active service, along with a truly monstrous damage profile at the bottom there. Take a look at that. 16,313 damage. Yowzers. Followed by 3,645 anti-air and 3,559 siege. That is not to be sniffed at. That is a lot of damage coming out of an 8 command point destroyer. Now, I fully upgraded this one because these sit in my fleet. Let's have a look what makes it different. Well, first of all, we have more base armor. Now, this is slightly lying to you, the stats here, but you can see down there originally it was 42,136 compared to 32,980. Also, the original offensive type had 20 armor, whereas the assault type started with 30. This can then be upgraded again using some of these abilities here. You can see I've increased the physical resistance there by 8. I've then increased the ship HP by 20%. You can go for additional resistance if you're going to be going up against a lot of physical tanking, but I think that's just a nice way of sort of doing it. The assault kind of takes the best bits of the offensive type and the defensive type, which we'll get to in a moment, and works really nicely with them in a slightly different way. I actually think, if I've done my math right, that the Oxhorn Pulse Cannon here actually comes out higher damage than a fully upgraded standard Taurus does. Ultimately, again, if we have a look at this, it has one fantastic ability that we'll see in a moment. It is now prioritizing large ships. That is your difference. That in the mid-game, if you're wanting to use this one, you definitely can do, and it'll start shooting through some of those smaller targets because, well, none of these other ships are on there. If you're early on in your phase, you're not up against battleships, carriers, battle cruisers, or auxiliary ships, so it will shoot at frigates and destroyers. but if you absolutely wanted to focus on those, you will need to stick to the offensive type. We do still have that energy shield penetration, which makes this absolutely beastly. Genuinely, the fact that you're prioritizing those heavy ships and then you're ripping their shields off, it's hilarious. It's genuinely hilarious. Looking at the enhancements though, we do straight away have an energy damage output enhancement. When the target's a cruiser, it'll increase damage by 35%, and the attack cooldown will increase by 15%. So you get an increase in your damage, but at the cost of more time between shots. And it does work out massively in the favor of the Taurus to go for this. If you're going up against cruisers, this is an ability you just need. Just get that enhanced. Next, after that, you're looking at your pulse cannon damages. Ultimately, again, damage is going to work out better because that attack cooldown there is going to go up by 15%. Amplifying your damage further based on these does work out really nicely. Then we take the weapon system cooldown enhancements just to help, like, alleviate a little bit of that 15% cooldown reduction. And that gives us terrifying damage per minute. You do also get a increased weapon hit rate against cruisers and the higher class ships. Ultimately, I've never really needed it. I've tried testing this one, but pulse cannons are just so accurate anyway that additional accuracy always felt like wasted tech points for me, or if not wasted tech points, a wasted enhancement slot, because obviously you've only got so many enhancements you can use. If you absolutely want to go for this, it's probably best to replace the cruiser one. When you're hitting a point where you're not going against cruisers anymore, then perhaps, yeah, you could drop that and use the large target correction to start shooting at some of those bigger targets and dealing damage directly to them. There is also a siege damage one. It's nice to have. I think a lot of people overlook this one and just underestimate it, but that ability to increase your siege damage by a whopping 30%, if you're going in a siege fleet up against a city and you're not one of the frontliners because you're using Tauruses, for crying out loud, that can be absolutely brutal. That additional 30% siege damage on top of already 3,559, it's a lot of damage. That's a lot of damage that will just rip through enemy installations, and I love it for that. Again, we do have the energy system upgrades. Again, 15% basic damage up front, followed by an additional 10% damage and 15% cooldown. Well worth going for once you get those tech points. If we go into the propulsion system, you'll notice that here we don't have those evasion abilities anymore. That has gone from the offensive version. The assault version does not have those. So you get more tanking potential, but at the cost of reduced evasion. And to me, that makes the assault a really interesting choice between the offense and the assault, and I do use both of them at certain points during the phase. I will often actually, as you start hitting cruisers for the first time, be running a fleet that is running both the assaults and the offenses. And the offenses tend to actually absorb the damage a little bit better than the assaults at that point, but later on in the game, when the ships you're up against don't tend to prioritize destroyers, you can find the assault does a lot better just for that harder damage output. Finally then, let's have a look. We do also have the reinforced armor system. This is where things do become a little bit more favorable for any damage that you do take from some of the larger ships later on. The ability to reduce crit damage received and increasing the main system by 30% is a whopping big upgrade that does really help with survivability. But again, ultimately, for me, the Assault Destroyer prioritise the damage first and then come back for tanking later, kind of as we did with the offensive type. This brings us finally then to the defensive type, the Type C Taurus Defensive Destroyer. This is an unusual little ship. I have never really found it all that useful compared to some of the others, but if you have it, it does allow you to make a terrifyingly effective Taurus-only fleet. You can have 30 Tauruses in one fleet, assuming you have enough enhancement points to actually make that work. And it's a cool little fleet to run around with. It's incredibly slow moving, but my god, it hits hard. So again, let's have a look at the stats. This time around, the damage is significantly lower on its standard firepower. You'll see even the offensive type started at 6,210, the B type started at 7,000, the offensive only starts at 4,800, but it does get really nice anti-air, gets higher anti-air than either the offensive type or the assault type, which is useful for keeping it alive when your enemies start sending aircraft at you, obviously. Again, basically before we even start, we've got excellent armor there, 42,136 with 30 armor straight off the bat. And if we go into the armor system, obviously you can increase that HP whoppingly there and add more physical resistance to the armor if you wish. We do once again get the reinforced armor system, which reduces crit damage and increases the main system HP, and those are probably the ones you're going to want to go for first if you're using the armored type. If we go into the propulsion system, you'll see that this goes back to just being cruising and warp speed. No evasion on this boy. It is just a tank that is going to sit there and just take that damage. Now, like the offensive and the assault type, we first of all have an energy system, which can be used to increase the pulse cannon damage and reduce its cooldown, and the weapon itself. If we go in and have a look at this, you'll see things here are very similar to what we've seen before on the offense type. We've still got that energy shield penetration, it's still got that same offensive attack priority, destroyer, frigate, corvette and fighter, with an anti-aircraft version here that adds in corvette and fighter as its only priority. The advantage of this one, though, is it has interception capability, able to intercept missiles or torpedoes. You can shoot down missiles or torpedoes that are coming at you. That's pretty badass, if I do say so. Now, when we come into the enhancements here, we've got a good wide range. Going on that whole ability to intercept, you can go for a radar anti-missile enhancement, only 8 enhancement points for 25% additional chance to intercept missiles and torpedoes. That is just monstrous, and if you're going up against a fleet of things like Reliats and winged hussars, etc., then this enhancement will just do work. It will just do work for days and help keep this alive just by ensuring it doesn't even get hit. We do obviously have our standard weapon upgrades here, the ability to hit frigates and destroyers, which is weird because they're not really on the attack priority that much of this thing. The hit rate against fighters and corvettes I think is a good one to have because again it adds to that self-defense, and we do have an anti-aircraft support strategy, again probably worth it. All weapons in the system lock onto enemy aircraft in the nearby row, launch attacks, increasing hit rate by 40% every 30 seconds for 25 seconds. So you get a 40% increase, 30-second duration, 25-second duration, and then it will drop for 5 seconds and then come back and keep doing that. Ultimately, to me, the Taurus Defensive Destroyer is, as I said, it's a bit of a weird bag. It's quite expensive for what it is. It's a good tank, and it has really nice interception capabilities there. The fact that it can survive those missiles a little bit better is really cool. I just ultimately think that the Eris armor works out a little bit better than the Taurus Defensive. I might be controversial in saying that I'm sure there are people out there who swear by the defensive type as their main destroyer tank, and I don't think they'd necessarily be wrong for that. It might be that they work better in different situations. I've stopped using a lot of destroyer tanks in a lot of my fleets because the assault type of the Assault Destroyer Taurus just, it's enough. It does well enough for me. It stays alive with a little bit of healing from something like a series support, or heck, even a Tundra support or a Guardian support. Even a Noma Force M470 assault support can do that job nicely. So I personally stopped using destroyer tanks all that much, but I did favour the Eris more over the Taurus. 1, it's a command point cheaper. 2, it's got that inbuilt evasion and that to it. Okay, yeah, the defensive type Taurus probably does more damage than the Eris armoured, but I'm using it for a tank, not for damage. If I want damage, I'll go for the offensive or the assault type, depending on what I'm up against. Once you hit cruisers and above, the assault type absolutely is your best friend. The offensive type will see you through the early game pretty much on its own. It is an astonishing little ship, and if like me you get up to the 100 tech points on it, build the offensive type, have all those tech points in there, and once you start facing cruisers, retire them, remove the tech points across to the assault type, rebuild us those, and just laugh all the way to the bank. Anyway, folks, those are my thoughts and opinions on the Taurus Assault Destroyer. I'd love to know what you guys think about this one. I think there's some interesting stuff going on with this. It is absolutely a versatile blueprint that is well worth having. Even if you just get the offensive type, that is one heck of a powerful ship that will actually see you through the early game, way into the mid game, and possibly even into the later game. The assault type works fantastically from mid game onwards. The defensive type, bit of a mixed bag. It'll do the job if that's the job you're looking for. I personally think there are better options, but if you've got the defensive type and not the Eris armoured, it still does amazingly. Let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comment section down below. Otherwise, folks, thanks for watching right the way through to the end. Happy sailing, and see you in Infinite Lagrange.